today. This is my third show and tell. The first one I did, I don't even know when it was, but it was when I lived in San Francisco, and I think it might have even just been Kate's class.
It was before show and tell.
So I was sitting on my bed over Skype. It was super chill. I didn't even prepare anything. It was like more of a Q&A. And then I came back about 5 years ago and did one in, it wasn't this room, it was a different room. And so here I am again. So it's always a pleasure to be at PSU. So today, the focus of my talk is mostly my latest book, and we'll get to that in a second. As Max mentioned, I am an artist, illustrator, and now author. And how many of you identify as graphic designers? How many of you identify as, you can raise your hand more than once, in fact, I encourage it. How many of you identify as illustrators? Okay. And just, what about fine artists, people who just like to make personal work? A little bit. Okay. So if you've ever thought about what it might be like to make a book, and I say make a book because as artists, sometimes we end up doing a lot more gathering of information and facts and that kind of thing, and representing that, whatever the book is about, visually more than we do writing. I also happen to write quite a bit, but some of my books just have pictures in them, which is fun. And some have pictures and a few words, and some are now more increasingly becoming almost entirely words. So like I said, this is my latest book. It's called The Joy of Swimming. It came out a little over a month ago, and I've been on a book tour, which I just got home from yesterday. And I'm really going to be delving into the process of making this book as much as I can in 30 minutes. But for those of you who aren't really familiar with my work, I made a little thumbnail slideshow, which is sort of, the images are tiny, but you can kind of get an idea for my color palette and the work that I do. I'm gonna, clickers, a little funny. So I do a lot of pattern design. I obviously like the color blue. I'm working in it a lot lately. And do a combination of painting and drawing, both realistic, representational drawing, and abstract painting and drawing. I'm an avid sketchbook keeper, and I brought 3 sketchbooks with me today, which I'm going to pass around in a moment. I didn't start painting or drawing until I was 31 years old. I'm entirely self-taught. Yeah, when I was in my early 30s, I decided that I was really bored at my job and I was going through a really hard time in my life. I'd just broken up with somebody and was very sad and needed to find something to occupy my time, so I started taking art classes. And one thing led to another, and I sort of fell in love with painting and drawing. And at first, like most people who start painting and drawing for the first time, especially at that age, you're sort of terrible at it. But I loved it so much, and I loved the process of it so much that I just kept doing it. And I started painting and drawing every day. And I took some more classes, but mostly I was just messing around at my kitchen table. And eventually, I would say about 6 years after I started this thing called the internet. Started to become a space for people who were creative, not necessarily even professional people, but people like me who were just making things for fun. That's actually how I met your teacher, Kate, back in the day. She was just finishing up grad school. I was just getting started, as a maker. I was 6 years into being a maker, but finally feeling brave enough to share my work on the internet. And there was this place called Flickr, which feels so old school to me now, but at the time that was where, it was before Instagram, before Facebook, before any of that, before Tumblr even. And that's where I met a lot of people who were also either experimenting or just starting their art careers, and I connected with a lot of people who ended up being super influential in my life and offering me opportunities. And so eventually I realized I can make a living doing this thing, at least part-time, and that's really how it started for me. I also owned a store in a gallery in San Francisco, and did that for a few years also while I was making art part-time. just to sort of try to cull together a full-time income. And then eventually things took off for me in about 2010, and I sold the store with my business partner to someone else. The store still exists, and that was in San Francisco, and then and embarked on a full-time career as an illustrator. And since that time, I've worked with probably over almost 70 clients, and here are some of them. I'm going to just flip through this. This is a sort of shortened version of a talk that I've been giving recently. So some of the parts of it I'm going to flip through a little bit more quickly. This makes your head spin. I definitely need to take a break. Okay, so Chronicle Books is the client that I've been working with the most often and the most intensively over the last 10 years of my career. I had an art show at this little gallery in San Francisco. When I first started out, I was just making collages and painting and drawing. I had no idea what it meant to be an illustrator. I had no idea you could even make a living licensing your work or doing any kind of surface design. That wasn't something that I ever sort of imagined. But so I thought being an artist meant you had a show in a gallery, so that's what I did. And at this particular show, somebody from Chronicle Books, Chronicle is a San Francisco-based publisher, showed up, and she liked my work. So she went back to her office and she said to one of the editors there, "You should bring this gal in for a meeting." And I don't even know if I had a website at the time. And so they brought me in, and I talked to them, and I like threw together a portfolio of very minimal amount of work that I had, and they were like, "We want to do some stationery with you." And so I did this stationery with them, where I basically made some paintings similar to some paintings that had been in the show, and did my first line of products. And around that time, a couple other clients came my way. I didn't have a big internet presence at the time, but that was sort of how I was meeting people nonetheless. And so over the next few years, I started building my portfolio, working with more and more clients. For a period of about 6 years, I had an agent. I don't anymore. I have a literary agent, but not an illustration agent. So that helped. But all the while, I just continued to work with Chronicle Books. First on some stationery products, and then I was illustrating books that other people had written. And then eventually in 2012, which was 6 years after I started working with them, they came to me and said, "We want to make a book with you." And I had done this project in 2012 called 365 Days of Hand Lettering. So I wanted to be a better hand letterer, and it was something that I felt like I didn't have enough practice in, or I hadn't developed my own style. So every day for the year, I hand lettered something different and posted it on the internet and on my blog. And so we ended up making a book out of it. That book is called Whatever You Are, Be a Good One, and it's now sold like almost 200,000 copies. It was the most unexpected kind of crazy thing. I got like an advance that was this big for that book because it was my first book, and I didn't have a literary agent at the time, and I didn't really understand anything about literary contracts. But the book ended up sort of blowing up. It's just a book of hand-lettered quotations that were part of this project that started on my blog. And I wasn't even that excited about the book. It wasn't a dream project for me. It was just like I had all of this artwork already made, so let's make this book. In 2013, after the book came out, and the end of 2013, the book was already like a month into it. The book had already sold out of its first run. So when that happens, your publisher usually calls you up and says, "Let's make another book. You're onto something." So then we made a sequel called Fortune Favors the Brave, which incidentally has not done as well as Whatever You Are, Be a Good One. You know what they say about sequels? So I think there's maybe 3 sequels in the history of books that have done better than the first book, but we tried, and I actually like this book better, but and all of these quotations in the book are more focused on one specific topic, which is courage and bravery. So then my editor turned to me and she said, "If you could make a book about whatever you wanted, what would it be about?" And I kind of looked at her with a blank stare, and I said, "I have no idea." And that's not because, and I want you guys to think for a second, if somebody asked you that question, what, if anything, would immediately come to mind? And probably for some of you, maybe, but for some of you, it would take you a minute to really think, or maybe even a week or a month to think about if you could make a book about whatever you wanted, what would it be about? It's not like we sit around all day thinking about that. And so I basically looked at her and I said, I have no idea. And again, it's not because I don't have ideas or that I'm not a creative person. I just didn't know immediately. So we sat there and talked for a while, and I realized I have this opportunity. A publisher's coming to me because I had another book that's done well, and they want to work with me again. What is something that I'm really passionate about that, because making a book, as I'm about to tell you, is a lot of hard work. And I knew, because I had been through it once already, well, actually twice. There was another book that came out before Whatever You Are, Be a Good One, which I'll talk about later, with a very, very small publisher. I knew from making books before that I had to, that I needed the book to be something that I cared a lot about. So we talked for a long time, and Bridget said, what about swimming? I'm a lifelong swimmer. I've swum my whole life. I swim competitively on and off my whole life, and I love the water. She knew this about me. I sort of waxed poetic about swimming on Instagram and other things. And so I said, that's kind of an interesting idea, like a book about sports. Like, even though I'm a swimmer, I consider myself more of an artsy person than a jock necessarily. And she said, no, we could make a really artful book about swimming. So I said, what the heck, let's go for this. So that happened. This is the part in the talk where I normally read from the book, but I'm not going to bore you with that today. This is a picture of me when I was about 8 years old with braces, posing in front of the pool for my swim team picture. And this is actually me in my 20s. I swam master swimming for many years and traveled around the world to compete. So swimming's been a big part of my life. So the question I get a lot, since I've made several of them now, is what is it like to make a book? And that all depends on what kind of book you're making. So the experience of making Whatever You Are, Be a Good One, or Fortune Favors the Brave, or my first book collection today, was actually really different than what I'm about to tell you now. And the book that I just made, The Joy of Swimming, is different in that it is a collection of information. It has like infographics. I knew I wanted to talk about the history of swimming, and I knew I wanted to profile different swimmers, and the whole thing was going to be have both writing and illustration. So I knew I was embarking on something that was more intense and sort of different than just drawing and making a collection of drawings to go in a book. So increasingly, I'm making more and more books that are sort of nonfiction books that have interesting facts in them. I even am in a contract to write my first children's book, which will be a nonfiction book as well. So this is a little bit about the process of making a nonfiction book that's illustrated. So it's fun, it's overwhelming, it's fun again, then it's tedious, then it's more tedious, then I want to stab my eyes out, and then it's finished. That's sort of what it's like to make a book. And it usually takes anywhere from 6 months to a year from start to finish. Some publishers give you more time, depending on the topic. Some publishers give you less time. But that's sort of the general rule. And the first phase for me is the brainstorm phase. And don't let the dirt cloud and raindrops fool you. This is the rainbows and butterflies phase. This is where you get to imagine all of the beautiful things your book is going to be. Because no work has happened yet. This is the imagination. This is like all of this stuff you want to go in your book. In my case, all the famous people who are going to agree to be in it, all of the beautiful illustrations I was going to make, all of the things I was going to have time to research and write about and illustrate over the next 6 months. And when you're in that phase, it's a little scary to think about how am I going to accomplish all of these things, but it's really fun to brainstorm. I liken this phase to like the honeymoon phase of a relationship when you first meet somebody, and you're already sort of walking down the aisle or like growing old together, and you just met them because everything feels magical. And that's sort of what the beginning, am I right, Kate? That's the beginning phase of the book is like that. It's just like it's on the New York Times bestseller list. It's like everything about it is amazing. And then the work starts. So the first phase, or the second phase for me, after I've brainstormed everything I want to go into the book, is organizing. And you know, a lot of artists, we get categorized as people who are super disorganized. And while there are parts of my brain that are rather disorganized, I'm in general a sort of organized person. I'm lucky. I feel like the right side of my brain and the left side of my brain work equally as hard. So I geek out over a good spreadsheet just as much as I do about making art. And this is good, especially when you're making a book that has lots of facts and information that's going to go in it, and lots of different sections. And The Joy of Swimming is a book that you sort of can open up anywhere inside of it. I'm going to actually pass it around so you guys can look at it, and we'll also pass around my sketchbooks. Which, by the way, some of them have pastel or oil pastels in them, so I have like little pieces of vellum that are protecting the pages. Just make sure those stay intact. So anyway, this is a spreadsheet that I made to organize the information that was going to go in my book. So once I had done the brainstorm, I took all of the information from my brainstorm and I put it into categories. I knew I wanted the book to have bios, what I'm now calling profiles of living swimmers, like actual real people who swim every day. And as it turns out, most of the people in my book are not famous. They're just regular people. I started to try to contact some famous swimmers and ran into a lot of, I'm writing another book now that I'm trying to get more well-known people to contribute interviews, and my studio manager, Kristen, is here, and we can tell you, like, you think you could email anyone and they'd be like, sure, you want me to be in your book? I'll make time for you, but most of the time the answer you get is I'm too busy, or you don't get an answer at all. And I was encountering a lot of roadblocks in terms of getting like these famous swimmers like Michael Phelps and others to be in my book. So I ended up just profiling regular people, and that ended up being a great focus for the book, because just regular people have some amazing, amazing swimming stories, and I'll share some of those with you in a minute. I also wanted to profile some, you know, dead people, basically swimmers from history who were really pioneering in the sport. I wanted to make sure that I covered like the history of swimming. What's the history? Where was the first swimming pool? How did it come to be? Where was it? When did swimming go from being open water to in a pool? What's the history of Olympic swimming? This was all, I had a natural curiosity about all of this. I knew I wanted to put some inspirational quotes in there, because that's part of what I do. Some aphorisms, which are basically like really common sayings, like dive in and things like that. And then I just wanted plain old artwork, like just stuff that was fun to paint. Like I have a spread that's vintage swimming caps and bathing suits from, you know, across the last century, things like that. And I also wanted to include photos in the book. I wanted the book to have photos, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. But here's the reality. The reality is that even when you brainstorm all of this stuff and you put it in a chart and you start to research it, the book that you have at the end of the process looks nothing, well, it looks something like what you started, the ideas you started with. But over the course of the next 6 to 9 months as you're making the book, you realize, for example, that you can't get the famous people to be in your book that you wanted, so you have to make some compromises, or that illustrations you thought were going to look really amazing look like crap, or that information you thought was going to be really easy to access is actually really hard, or there isn't much out there. So what your book looks like in the end is always really different than what you start out with, but that's an important thing to remember, because with any creative project that's going to be super intensive and take you this amount of time over a period of months should have some flexibility built into it, because you also you never know what you might discover along the way that wasn't on your original chart. The next phase for me was research and outreach. So there are a lot of infographics in the book which I hand drew, and I'm actually going to show you a little bit later. I brought some of the original art. And I'll talk a little bit about my process for illustrating. But here's a piece that I made on distance swimming, and you can actually see here, this is a painting from So when I make my work, I don't actually, I usually, like, here's some hand lettering that I did, that I ended up moving things around digitally. I rely a lot on Photoshop. So I'll draw something or hand letter something and then scan it, and then I play with it in Illustrator. I'm sorry, in Illustrator sometimes, but in this case it was Photoshop. And that, like you can see, there's a piece that I drew up here in this corner that I ended up drawing a line through because I must have re-lettered it somewhere else and dropped it in. I do my lettering separate from my painting and then plop them together. Here's another one, like I think I have somewhere in here. This was just like, here's the painting, here's the hand lettering. I like draw the outline of my titles and then fill them in Photoshop and then color them digitally a lot of the time. Other infographics, science of swimming. I also profiled like different swimming pools around the world and the rules and how they're different. So in Iceland, pools are like social centers and people go on dates and have business meetings at pools. It's crazy. How many of you, have any of you ever been to Iceland? Yeah, like pools are such an important part of the culture there because it's cold geothermal energy which powers the pools. So I wrote a lot about that. I'm actually going to Iceland in a week and a half, and I'm gonna, for the second time. And the first time I went, I never went to any of the pools, and this time I'm gonna be sure to visit. In Japan, they have super strict rules, like you cannot go in a pool, public pool if you have tattoos. Super, super strict, no horseplay. Whereas like in Iceland, playing is encouraged. There's one more on Paris pools, which I'll show you later. There's a history of the bikini. It was invented by this guy who was like an auto designer, and he made it so small that it could fit in a matchbox. I mean, there's so many interesting things that I discovered while I was researching the history of swimming. Here's women's bathing suits over the 20th century. This was a fun one because I got to pick suits to highlight in this little infographic. And I also researched veteran, swimmers who, from the early part of the century when competitive swimming was really becoming a thing, and pool swimming became a thing, and wrote little bits about them and why they were important in the history of swimming. So that was super fun. The next phase after I did the research was to start interviewing people. So I put this call out on my blog and I said, email me with the names of all the interesting people, or all the people you know who might have an interesting swimming story. They don't need to be famous, they just need to be people who have interesting swimming stories. And I got so many responses, it was really amazing. And then I started writing both the information for the infographics and the profiles of the different swimmers. The story is really amazing. She was a stellar swimmer when she was in high school, got all these scholarships, and then ended up like getting into drinking and drugs. And like basically the 10 years of her life between 20 and 31, she didn't swim, hardly swim at all, and was in and out of programs, and finally got sober when she was 31. And I guess it was something like 5 days after she got out of rehab, she got back in the pool. And within 5 months, she was breaking world records. And continued to do that for 20 years, between the age of 31 and 50. And she's in her 50s now, and she's retired, I think, mostly from competitive swimming. But she went back to college when she was 35 and swam competitively at Cal State Bakersfield. She calls it her do-over, right? Because she was a super talented swimmer as a teenager, but then, got caught up in boys and partying and ended up being an addict. And so when she got sober, she was like, I'm going back to college. I don't care if I'm 35. So she was competing against women who were, 13 to 14, 15 years younger than she was and kicking their butts. So, and now she runs this big swim school in Hawaii. Shell was born with spina bifida. Spina bifida is this horrible neurological, muscular, skeletal disease that just basically cripples you. And so she describes herself as somebody who's super clumsy on land. She's been having surgeries her whole life to try to help her body. And the only place that she feels strong and graceful is in the water. And she swims 5 miles a day and has for like 5 years. She's 40 now. She discovered it was like the thing that helped her get strong and feel graceful. Maya was born with achondroplasia dwarfism, and she's 14 now, but she had to take a break from swimming because when you grow up with dwarfism, your body needs help sometimes surgically to grow, and she had to take like last year off from swimming. She's an amazing swimmer. To have the surgery and recover, and she's getting back in the water now and is super excited. And her goal is to go to the 2020 Paralympic Games in Tokyo. Alexander was born with cerebral palsy. He says the water is the only place he doesn't struggle. So the more I interview people, the more I was learning that there are just all these stories of people who had overcome heartache and addiction and physical disabilities by being in the water. The water really holds people. And comforts them, and in a way that they didn't experience outside of the water. This is Caleb and Zion. They're the youngest people in the book. They're now 10, but they're fraternal twins, and they are from competitive swimmers in Chicago. This is Paul. He's the oldest guy in the book. He's 92, or now he's probably 93 now. So next step is, and again, this isn't super linear, right? Like all of this is happening kind of simultaneously. The illustration and photographs. I wanted the book to have some really interesting information in it. So I made a lot of different infographics, some of which I've shown you. So again, I would have created this by like painting the background, and then I draw on vellum or tracing paper because it's a nice smooth surface, and you can draw over something so that you get the proportion of what you're lettering over the artwork that's going to go in the background. And then I throw them together in Photoshop and move things around in layers. It's another infographic. This is the little spread on Paris pools. You have to wear a cap, even if you're bald. It's the rule, and if you come without one, there's a vending machine. You can buy one there. You have to wash your feet. Anyway, my friend, who's an awesome graphic designer, actually, Ann Dittmeyer, she helped me do the research. She swam in all 37 public pools in Paris. She actually has a profile in the book, too. I wanted the book to have a sense of humor and also evoke nostalgia. This was one of the first illustrations that I made because the smell of chlorine to me is like the epitome of everything as a swimmer. Signs, gear. I have these. These are, so these I just drew, and then I changed the color of the caps in Photoshop. So clean them up a little bit. Some dogs were great swimmers. Notice it says some. I posted this on Instagram. People were like, excuse me, you didn't include the such and such or the such and such. And I'm like, sorry, I only have room for, everyone's an expert on Instagram. Yeah, so notice it says some, not all. Backyard pool shapes. Some of these are for real, serious names of pool shapes, and some are just me being silly. The anatomy of the swim parka. If you've ever been a competitive swimmer, you probably, to any great degree, you probably had swim parka. And then I also collected some vintage photos. Most of them are in oceans and lakes, and then did a little fun coloring in Photoshop. So in 2010, I mentioned a book that I published called A Collection a Day. It is a book that that was based on a project that I did in 2010 called A Collection a Day, where I photographed one weird collection. I collect lots of weird things, and they were arranged similar to this on a white background, on a sort of imaginary grid, and the project became really popular, and then the book was published, and a lot of the work that I've done since then has sort of grown out of that project. And so I really wanted to include these kinds of collections photos in this book. And so I happened to have a collection of vintage swimming medals and patches. So I was able to, that's actually just one page, not a spread, and same with that one, but I was able to include some photos in the book of things that I collected. See, Kate, there's that book.
Oh, and it's such a good book.
I know. And then some other old swimming books that I laid out and photographed. All the ways I love to work in one book. So that was a great thing. Chronicle's awesome. They give me a lot of creative freedom. I'm working on another book right now that, the scary part is, well, I'll talk about this in a second. Oh, before I talk about the end phase, another reality, and that is, like, to a certain extent, you might spend a lot of time working on something for your book and then realize it's just not working. So one of the things I spent a gazillion hours doing, and I don't know why I ever thought this was going to be a good idea, but once the train left the station, I just went with it. I hand lettered there are 37 profiles in the book. And so in addition to all of the infographics, I hand lettered all of the bios. And it was painstaking, and then I put them into Photoshop and cleaned them up. And then when the book was finished, I had done all of them, and I was like, this is going to be so hard for people to read. It's too much hand lettering. There's too much information that's hand lettered. It's not going to be legible enough. I feel like it's going to be an assault to people to open this book and have everything be in my handwriting. So I decided at the 11th hour to take that out and have everything typeset. And it was the best decision I could have made. I think it makes the book so much easier to digest. And of course, my editor was like, are you sure? I was like, yes, I'm sure. So fortunately, that was my decision and not anybody else's. But so then you deliver the files over this thing called FTP most of the time. And then you celebrate for at least 2 days because wait, it's not over. So basically for 6 months, you've just been working on your book. At least in my case, you work, don't have a lot of interaction with the publisher unless you have a question, and then you turn it in, and then they have to review it and edit it. So reality is that there are lots of edits and revisions. For the most part in this book, I didn't have to edit a lot of the illustrations. I did have to replace a couple of them that weren't working. And we had to copy edit a lot of the stuff that was hand lettered, which is a little bit more painstaking than copy editing stuff that's typeset. Oh yeah, and then you have the title and the cover, which always come last. This is on the top here is the cover that we ended up using, but on the bottom were some other mock-ups of things we were playing around with. And actually, this is the actual PDF that my book designer sent me with some notes from the sales team, because that's who decides what if the cover is right or what if the title is right. And we went round and round and round about the title. You even have to make sure that it's going to show up on Amazon, right? And the sales team really weighs into that. We went round and round about the title. It was something completely different, but they wanted it to sound really peppy. And not that I'm not a peppy person, but I was really wanted it to have a more serious title. So we did, in the end, have a title that has the word joy and celebration in it, which is maybe slightly cheesy. And I'm like one of those people who abhors cheesy titles, and unless you're being purposefully ironic, which I wasn't. Like, they wanted me to call the book Dive In, and I was like, that is the dumbest title ever. And it really doesn't have very much to do with what's in the book. So we went back and forth a lot about the title. We finally came up with a title that I'm really happy with, and in truth, it's way better than the title that I had originally proposed. But my lesson is, never get too attached to a title in your head while you're making a book, because it might end up being something totally different in the end. I don't know if it's me or the clicker. Oh, then off it goes to print. Finally, after all of that, months more of editing back and forth with the editor, making sure everything's right, get the color proofs back. And then, yeah, the reality is it takes another long period of time while your book is being printed. And then finally, you have the final book when it arrives in the mail. And in this case, when I got the book, I felt so much more excited about the book as a physical book than when I sort of was only looking at it on the computer screen or as a PDF. I've gotten other books and been actually disappointed that I felt like what I saw on the computer screen looked more vibrant than the actual printing of the book, and in this case it was the opposite. Like, I was really excited to get the final book. So for me, I get to make a book about something that I love to do. Swimming and art, it was like the magical combination for me. I'm making another book right now that is due in the next few months. And well, the manuscript is due in about a month, right, Kristen? And then the illustrations are due in September. And it's a book about women over 40 who are either late bloomers, so women like me who didn't start doing or had a second career later in life, or who are like amazing older women who are amazing athletes or doing kind of crazy athletic feats or adventuring feats later in life, and older women who are just doing generally amazing things. So it's profiles of women from history, interviews with women, living women, and essays by women over 40 about like, funny stories and things. And I'm illustrating the whole thing. So my process for this book is similar, lots of spreadsheets, more moving parts. So making the swimming book was really great practice for this book. And then I'm working on another book that is called, well, I shouldn't say what it's called because the title might change, but right now it's called The Big Book of First Lady. So it's like a feminist book for kids on the first ladies, so not what they wore to the ball gown, but sort of like who they were as women and what they contributed. So yeah, so thank you for being such great listeners, and I'm happy to answer any questions about bookmaking or my art in general, or while you guys are sitting here passing around my sketchbooks. So yeah.
Did you take on any other jobs when you were working?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually I think I meant to mention that. So I got a decent advance for this book, but it certainly wasn't enough to live on. And at the time I didn't have a studio manager or anyone helping me. It was just me working on the book full time. So I had to have other jobs. I was actually, there was a little bit of overlap between Fortune Favors the Brave and this book. And then I was working on probably like 5 or 6 different illustration jobs at a time. So, and that was just to sort of keep the momentum of the rest of my career moving, and also just to pay the bills. So that's usually, some people are really, really, really good at saying no to everything else while they make a book. I was on a panel of authors once at this conference, and somebody asked, do you guys work on anything else while you're making a book? And one woman was like, no, like I only work on the book and I don't do anything else. And I was like, yeah, I usually have 10 things going on. And I'm trying to change that a little bit because I feel like the book is going to be better if you have more time to devote to making it awesome. And there's things I would do differently with this book, or that I think could have been better if I had had more time, or even had Kristen to help me with it. But that's the reality of being a working artist, is that to make it, sometimes you've got to juggle a lot of things. Yeah.
How much input did you have in layout? Did you decide what all the layouts would look like?
That's a great question. So, okay. So I actually laid out the whole book. So that was another choice that I made. I said, what are the dimensions of the spread and what are the dimensions of the page? And I wanted to have control over, to a certain extent, Kristen laid out like the pages that I showed you that had the portrait of the swimmer and then like the text laid in. That was a little bit of her moving things around to make it flow. But for the most part, every other page in the book was made to scale. Like basically I either drew it, you know, on a template, or I drew the different elements and then laid them out in Photoshop to scale. This next book that I'm working on, I'm not sure that I'm going to do that. I think I might have her kind of figure out the layout. But this book was mostly illustrations with hand-lettered text, and it felt like a lot. I wanted to have control over what the final thing looked like my book designer did help me decide the order of the pages, because if you open up the book, you'll see that you can open the book up anywhere. There's no order. Like my introductory essays in the beginning, and Lynn Cox, who's a famous distance swimmer who swam to Antarctica back in the 90s, she wrote the foreword. Like those things are in the beginning, but everything else in the book is a mishmash. You can open it up anywhere. And so, but the order was important in that it needed to have a certain flow and to be able to sit next to each other and play with each other a little bit and not compete with each other. So Kristen, my book designer, and I worked together to get the order right, but I had already turned in pretty much pages and spreads. But that's a choice I made, and I think it was a good choice in the end. But some book designers just want you to turn in the artwork and they want to lay it out. So it just depends who you're working with, I think. Yeah.
How did you find your writing voice? If I can't write, I feel like I get embarrassed at all the things that I write, and I can't something that I wrote yesterday. I'd be like, oh God, why did I ever say that? And I just can't write. So I guess how do you feel that way sometimes?
Yeah, not so much anymore, but when I first started writing, you have to remember too that I didn't start writing until I was in my 30s. So, but by that time, I had a lot of life behind me, and I had found my voice in other ways. And I think that you'll discover this. In 10 years, you'll be like, if you keep trying to write, you'll eventually find. It's kind of like finding your design voice or your artistic voice. Writing is the same thing. It just requires sitting down every day and doing it. Now, if you don't feel like putting it out into the world, you don't have to. But there's Cheryl Strayed, who's this great local writer. She has this essay on the Rumpus called "Write Like a Motherfucker," and it's basically, she wrote this advice column in the Rumpus for a long time, and it was under a pseudonym of Dear Sugar, her name was Sugar. And some young aspiring writer wrote to her and was complaining about, not that you're complaining, but about finding her voice. And basically Cheryl's advice was, you have to sit down every day and write. The only way to become a good writer is to write. The only way to become a good artist is to make art. And even when it feels painful, or even when you feel embarrassed by your own work, no one else is reading it, but you read your own stuff and feel embarrassed. Yeah, it's like that. And I think that I spent most of my 20s just not having a creative life at all. I didn't go to art school like you guys, and so when I was in my 30s, I started to feel this urge. So I started writing and making art. And by the time I was in my late 30s, I had been doing it long enough. I was keeping a blog and writing on my blog that I started to develop a certain level of confidence around my writing. And the more I did it, the better I got at it. And now it just feels like it's still a get writer's block when I sit down and I have to write, but it feels so much easier. And I think it's just about doing it over and over and over. And as you get older, it never gets completely easy. It's always a little mortifying to put your work into the world, whether it's visual or written, but it does feel a little bit less hard. So, but that's a great question. I think it's just time. Yeah.
So, I asked what you did in your 20s for work.
Sure.
And did you ever think about drawing, or did you ever just not at all?
Well, so what's interesting is I grew up in a really artistic household. My mom is a textile artist. And, I grew up in a house where there was a lot of creativity and activities and encouragement. I think if I had at 18 said, I want to go study graphic design at PSU, or I want to go to RISD, my mom and dad would have been like, great. It's not even like I grew up in a household where being creative was discouraged or I was pressured into anything else. It's just that I never thought of myself as an artistic person, even though my mother was an artist and I was kind of surrounded by artists. I just didn't discover it until I was older. And so my first real job was I was a teacher. So I was an elementary school teacher. And I actually feel like that's where I found my creativity, was by teaching kids, because doing art activities with kids is there's nothing like it. And kids are so open and you can really get them to do anything. And they were making really magical stuff. And so but teaching was all consuming. I taught in a public school in San Francisco. I was overwhelmed. I felt like I worked 16-hour days just prepping, teaching, getting home, collapsing. And then I got a job at an education nonprofit. Changed because basically I went to work from 9 to 5 and I didn't have anything else and I had an office and I got to wear professional clothes and I wasn't doing anything creative like I was when I was a teacher, but I had all this time, and so what was it that I really yearned to do? And that was to be creative, and that's when I started taking art classes and kind of being a maker. But you know, like I learned to sew when I was really young, but I also feel like now, so you guys all sit here and you're like, understand on a deep level that making a living as a maker or a creative person is actually possible. Not that you're under any illusions that it's going to be easy, but it's such a part of our culture. You see it on the internet, but those of you, and there are a few of you in the room who are over 35, can remember there was a time when that wasn't the case at all. And so the idea of being an artist was like the idea of struggling. And so for me, even if it had come into my head at the time, I'm not sure I would have pursued it until the internet happened and all these opportunities happened for me, and I got to see examples of what it looked like to be an artist, and that it wasn't just this one thing, it could be lots of different things, and there was different ways you can monetize, you know, being a creative person. And that sort of motivated me, because I was always the person who wanted to be responsible, and I wasn't going to do something if I was going to have to starve and continue to borrow money from my parents. So you know, when that happened, it happened when I was in my 30s, that sort of renaissance in our culture, I think, where the arts became an acceptable way to make a living. I still feel like there's some resistance to that, but it's so much more normal now to say I'm an artist, I'm a designer, I'm an illustrator, this is how I make my living. When I was in my 20s, like, reality. And so when I meet people my age who actually went to art school in the early 90s and became working artists, I think they must have been incredibly strong people, because you know, what you had going against you at the time was a lot greater than today. Like now you can make it just by like, the internet provides so many opportunities and tools to become an artist. And at the time you had to have an agent or a handler or somebody promoting your work, or you were gonna potentially not be able to feed yourself, or you had to have another job. And it's really different now. Like I gave the commencement address at Minneapolis College of Art and Design a couple weeks ago, and my message was basically there's never been a better time to be an artist, because there's never been so many tools and resources and platforms to show your work and to get paid for your work. So I feel lucky that in a way that I like entered the profession at the cusp of that.
You spoke a little bit about interviews and trying to get people to interview. Can you talk a little bit more about your research process? So for something like the First Lady's book, how do you tackle the profile?
Yeah, well, that book won't have any interviews, but so the book that I'm working on, so just to put some context, when I was making the swimming book, it was just me. So when I would run into a problem of like something was going to take me a lot of time or effort, I would just kind of scrap the idea and find the easier route. So in the case of the swimming book, in my mind's eye, when I first was in that rainbows and butterflies phase of envisioning the book, I was going to have these well-known swimmers in the book. Not that I wasn't also going to just have regular people, but I wanted some famous swimmers in the book to help market the book better. And it actually may have, but I ran into so many problems trying to sort of like get emails for people and get people to return my emails, and it was just me, and I was overwhelmed, and I was like, I can't be spending all of my time tracking down these sort of household swimmer names to be in my book. And so I scrapped that idea and I just went with regular people. Now I have an almost full-time studio manager, and it's like her job to basically track people down, write the emails to the people, try to sweet talk them into getting on the phone with me, that kind of thing. And she also researches, like right now we're looking for women over 40 who are doing amazing things later in life. And you know, we need more people of color in the book, and there are just not as many stories online of women of color who, you know, so like we're having to really dig in and do research. So I have somebody who helps me with all of that. So this next book's going to be richer and deeper and better than the swimming book, because I have someone helping me with all of that research and like finding the right people and pinning them down. We still get a lot of no's. You know, we've emailed so many people, but people are busy. I say no all the time, like I get it, but for the First Lady's book, we haven't started that yet, but you know, the the research isn't about the who, because we already know who the first ladies are, but it's really about like finding those interesting things about them that haven't been told before, or telling their stories in a different way. And I think that's going to be the challenge. Like, what do we have to say about Nancy Reagan? You know what I mean? Like, it's hard. She's kind of hated by a lot of people. Just because you're a first lady doesn't mean you're like an awesome human being. But we have to include everyone in the book. So that's a challenge. And I think that's part of the challenge. Like, instead of looking at that as something that to give me anxiety about writing a book, I'm looking at it as like, this is an opportunity for me to figure out how to like tell the truth to kids, but in a way that is sort of like relatable and isn't going to offend anybody. And, you know, so again, these are just creative challenges. I hope that answered your question a little bit. Yeah.
And we're hitting 1 o'clock right now. I just want to let everyone know. I know that maybe one more question. Is that
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
It's like it's 2 questions, but one's like maybe fast.
Way to break the rules.
I know.
So, do you have a sketchbook for your sketchbooks? Because they're all like amazing.
Oh, thank you. No, this is like my play. Okay, so I don't keep like a sketchbook of so my work is sort of divided into personal work and professional, like commissioned work. And all of my commissioned illustration work and my books, I just sort of like mess around until I get something right. I don't necessarily sketch it out in sketchbooks. My sketchbooks are like my playground, like my own personal, like it's a way for me to make things that are exploding from my brain without the pressure of like, this is going to be for sale or somebody wants to buy a print of it or whatever. This is just like my place to play with surface design and color and I am, okay, so what's interesting is I am like a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to that kind of thing. And so, you know, I do spend a lot of time in my sketchbooks. When I have free time, that's what I do. But then this year I started what's called a messy sketchbook. And it's actually an old book that I'm just altering page spread by spread. And things are really messy in it. And I don't actually post pictures of all of it on the internet because sometimes and so messy that it just doesn't even feel like me. So, but I am trying to break out of that. It's just, you know, the tendency to want to like create this perfect spread in my sketchbook, but it's also super therapeutic and meditative for me. And I've been drawing and painting for so long that what might look painstaking to you is actually just how I draw, and you know, it just comes out of me while I'm watching television most of the time, or like sitting on a train or waiting for an airplane. I do travel a lot too, so. And I love the intricate drawing is like a form of meditation for me. Like it really calms me down. You know, adult coloring books are really huge. I actually have 6 adult coloring books on the market right now, and people are always like, "You're an expert on adult coloring books. Why do people love them so much?" And I'm like, I don't know. I would never draw in one. But the only way that I can relate to that is that how, you know, the drawings I make that might end up in a coloring book are my way. You know, people talk about how coloring in coloring books calms them down and it keeps them focused and it de-stresses them, and that's kind of what drawing in my sketchbook is like for me. And so was that, did you have a second question?
Well, it's to the spreadsheet thing. How are you actually using them? Say, is it just to organize like who you're talking to, or like a timeline? Or
yeah, well now for the book I'm working on now, there's like, it's a Google Doc with like 10 tabs, and there's like tabs for all different things. And that's partly because I have Kristen to help me organize everything, and it's partly because this book is like so much richer and has way more writing in it than this one book did. But I apologize that the spreadsheet that you saw was so blurry. It's impossible to see because it was basically screenshots of a Google spreadsheet. But that spreadsheet was basically just like a list of everything that was going in the book in categories. And the great thing about Excel or Google Docs is you can do a formula that counts. So I was keeping track of how many pages I had finished. And that was really helpful because at some point I was like, okay, the book is 144 pages and I finished 120. I have 20 more pages to fill, and that I had, you know, so I tried to plan that out in advance, but there's always going to be things that are shifting and moving, or things that you thought you were going to pursue as part of the book that you end up letting go of. So then you got to find something else that's going to fill the space. In my current book, it's more like, what are we going to have to scrap? I think we're going to have more than what we need. But with the swimming book, I was doing it by myself, and I was sort of scrambling to finish and fill it by the end with meaningful stuff. And the spreadsheet really helped me keep track of that. The flow, I could visually see how many, which categories had the most things in the book. And was there any category that was sort of lacking? Like originally, I only profiled Icelandic and Parisian swimming pools, and my editor was like, 2 is not enough. In order to make this feel more robust, you have to have a third. And then I did Japanese, which ended up being really interesting. So it was a great addition. But stuff like that, like lists and spreadsheets can be a great visual reminder of sort of like the robustness of something, if things are in categories. So, and it's a great way to keep track of your progress. Like I would mark X's when I had finished something, and then it would show me visually how many more I had to do, how many pages I had completed. So there was all these columns over to the right that you couldn't see, but that's sort of how I used that one. And similarly for my next book, and probably for First Ladies as well. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.